Hey guys, tonight we wander through the shadowed streets of medieval Europe, imagining the fog curling along cobblestones, lanterns flickering in the damp night air, and the distant tolling of a church bell that might just signal the end of someone's luck. You probably won't survive this if you think the past was quaint, because tonight we're poking around some of the darkest truths hidden behind the oddest masks. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, leave a comment with your location and local time. I want to picture you somewhere cozy while we creep through history. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge down a narrow alley, the smell of smoke and something rotting lingering at the edges of your senses. Ahead, a figure emerges draped in black, beaked mask pointing sharply like a bird of prey. The Plague Doctor. You might have seen pictures of these faces, all hollow eyes and creepy curves. But the mask wasn't just for style. Those long beaks were stuffed with aromatic herbs, mint, rosemary, and sometimes even dried flowers to ward off what they thought was miasma, the poisonous air-carrying disease. Oddly enough, the fresh herbs did provide a small level of protection against bacteria. Historians still argue whether these masks actually slowed the plague or were simply a psychological comfort for the doctors themselves. You squint at the sunken eyes behind glass lenses, thinking, well, at least someone's trying. Inside a dimly lit room, jars line shelves filled with strange concoctions. One potion contains crushed emeralds, supposed to cure the plague, apparently. You sniff it and gag slightly. Green dust never smelled like safety. Yet, surprisingly, some of these medieval remedies inadvertently worked because certain herbs had antibacterial properties. Lavender oil, for instance, was a real antiseptic. Imagine rubbing lavender on a wound while the world outside is collapsing. Your ancestors were part snake oil, part accidental genius. And just when you start feeling clever for recognizing the logic, you stumble across a skull propped in the corner, carved with mysterious symbols, cursed, maybe, or perhaps a clever mnemonic to remember remedies. Scholars still argue whether these practices were superstition, medicine, or a terrifying mix of both. Outside, again, rats scurry through the streets. The doctor's mask, oddly bird-like, almost mimics nature's predators, and you wonder if that was intentional. Some fringe accounts suggest doctors believed looking like a bird of prey could intimidate wandering spirits or, perhaps, ungrateful patients. There are even tales of plague masks being used as protective talismans for children, hung in nurseries. Weirdly enough, people believed the mere shape of the beak could breathe safety into a household. You chuckle at the thought, imagining tiny toddlers staring wide-eyed at a wooden bird perched over their cradle. And the clothes, oh, the clothes. Thick leather overcoat, gloves, a wide-brimmed hat. Not exactly stylish, unless your fashion magazine is Survival, 1348 edition. These layers unintentionally blocked flea bites, the actual carriers of Yersinia pestis. So while the masks looked ridiculous, the doctors were partly armored against the invisible enemy. You can almost hear the whispered doubts in the streets. Did that doctor save lives, or just look like a nightmare? Historians still argue whether the fearsome image of plague doctors actually helped enforce quarantine by making people obey rules faster. Now, let's wander to the more eccentric side of these outfits. Some doctors carried wands, wooden sticks, used to poke and prod patients without touching them directly. Imagine someone tapping your arm with a stick while you're delirious with fever. At least they didn't shove herbs down your throat, right? And yes, there are fringe reports that some beaks were even scented with crushed animal dung to mask the smell of the sick-done tea. Try this at home. You can almost smell it now, earthy, bitter, and oddly persistent, like a medieval air freshener gone horribly wrong. Walking further, you notice something in the street, a small handbill illustrating a doctor in full plague attire. Townsfolk reportedly treated the drawing with a mix of fear and awe. There's a rumor that some townspeople would refuse entry to anyone not wearing a mask, even visitors, creating one of the first crude forms of social distancing. Weirdly, it worked a little, limiting exposure to fleas and contagion. Scholars still argue whether this public fear helped reduce infections or simply increased panic. By the time you trudge back to your imagined safe home, the air feels thinner, more mysterious. You remember that beaked silhouette in the alley and wonder, were they grotesque harbingers of death, accidental chemists, or both? And that, dear listener, is the peculiar magic of medieval plague doctors. They were terrifying, somewhat effective, and undeniably iconic. As you settle into your blanket, try not to think about the herbal mixtures sitting in shadowed corners, quietly fighting invisible enemies while humanity panicked. You step out into a chilly evening, fog curling along the edges of half-timber bird houses, and suddenly hear a whisper carried on the wind. She's a witch, burn her. You shiver. Witch trials were real, brutal, and, surprisingly, sometimes absurd. You probably think it's all hysteria and fairy tales, but imagine yourself in a crowded town square, the smell of smoke heavy in the air, watching a woman, maybe your neighbor, accused of cursing the harvest. Historians still argue whether these trials were fueled more by superstition, property disputes, or plain fear of independent women. Either way, the results were deadly. You follow the crowd closer, noting the wooden stocks and makeshift gallows. Some accusations were outlandish, claiming someone turned into a black cat to steal milk, or that a child's sudden illness was caused by a neighbor's evil glance. Fringe accounts suggest some townspeople truly believed in magical flight, invisibility, or familiars, tiny demonic companions that aided witches. You imagine a cat with a mischievous glint plotting to ruin the village bakery. It's absurd, yes, but terrifying if you lived in 17th century Germany or England. One bizarre detail: confessions often involved torture. You squint at a pulley and chains in the corner of a dim hall, imagining a contraption twisting joints until words slipped out. Some townspeople later regretted it, while others claimed the witch's powers were real. The sheer scale was staggering: tens of thousands accused across Europe, thousands executed. You picture yourself being careful about every glance, every word. Imagine accidentally offending a neighbor and ending up in a trial because they were desperate for a scapegoat. Historians still argue whether the panic was more about controlling society or genuine fear of supernatural threats. Among the accused, a few were midwives or herbalists, ironically, the people who knew remedies for the plague or childbirth. You think about that women helping the sick, now suddenly targeted as agents of harm. Some fringe scholars even speculate that accusations sometimes stemmed from jealousy or professional rivalry, a shadow war disguised as spiritual justice. And yet, in odd instances, real criminal behavior was wrapped up in these charges. Someone poisoning livestock might genuinely be punished as a witch. The line between legend and reality blurs, and you start to wonder how many myths grew out of actual events. The methods of trial were bizarre by modern standards. Swimming a witch involved tying her hands and feet and tossing her into water. If she floated, she was guilty. If she sank, well, you do the math. You shiver, picturing the villagers murmuring, counting seconds, judging destiny like a spectator sport. Fringe accounts tell of witches. Mark small blemishes, considered proof of a pact with the devil, sometimes nothing more than birthmarks or scars. You notice the parallels to modern urban legends, people believing in signs that conveniently confirm their fears. Historians still argue whether some of these practices were purely psychological control or misguided law enforcement. You walk past a wooden table piled with suspicious powders, herbs, and charms. Some of these substances were used to treat ailments or protect livestock. Real folk remedies, misinterpreted as magical curses. You raise an eyebrow, realizing the absurdity. An innocent concoction could spark mass hysteria. Even more peculiar, accused witches were sometimes employed to prove their innocence in tests that would be considered cruel or deadly today. You almost laugh at the absurdity, then remember that humor was probably the last luxury on a village square drenched in fear. Interestingly, some witch accusations also intersected with politics. Local lords might encourage trials to consolidate power or seize property, and townsfolk got swept up in the momentum. Imagine gossip blending with political maneuvering, creating a whirlwind that swept anyone in its path. Fringe scholars still debate how much of the witch craze was genuine belief versus opportunistic manipulation. And, if you think about it, the echoes of these trials linger in our fascination with the occult, horror stories, and true crime obsessions today. By the time you leave the town square behind, smoke fading into the fog, you feel a strange mix of relief and awe. These trials, terrifying and ridiculous by turns, shaped communities in ways that still puzzle historians. The lessons are subtle. Fear can warp logic, stories can become law, and sometimes the line between myth and reality is thin enough to step through if you're not careful. You imagine that woman accused, trembling, yet alive in legend, and realize that the echo of these trials still haunts our collective imagination. You wander into a narrow, cobblestoned alley where the smell of damp straw and old grain fills your nostrils, and a strange sight catches your eye. A writhing, tangled mass of rats. Yes, the infamous rat kings. Tales of these grotesque knots of rodents have circulated for centuries, tales entwined by sticky substances, or simply by accident, creating a phenomenon that horrified medieval townsfolk. You shiver, imagining dozens of squeaking, clawing rats. Historians still argue whether all reported rat kings were natural occurrences, or sometimes deliberate hoaxes designed to spook communities. In fringe accounts, these rat kings were seen as omens, harbingers of plague, famine, or disaster. People genuinely believed that if a rat king appeared, Misfortune was imminent. You glance at a gutter, half expecting a black mass of fur to slither out, and feel your pulse quicken. Some records even suggest that specimens were preserved in museums as curiosities, though only a few verified examples exist. It's like nature's twisted art project, with a side of pure terror. You walk past the marketplace where merchants hawk spices and cloth, and you can't help noticing that rats seem oddly bold, scurrying in packs near the stalls. In reality, the health of a medieval town often depended on controlling these vermin rats, spread disease, ate food, and occasionally inspired legends. The so-called rat kings may have been more common in cold climates, where overcrowded nests could easily tangle tails together. Fringe zoologists suggest that some of the rat kings might have been preserved after death rather than being alive in that grotesque knot, meaning the terrifying stories were partly theatrical exaggeration. Meanwhile, townspeople whispered about seeing monstrous creatures in the sewers. One story tells of a rat king so massive that it could block entire alleyways, forcing villagers to retreat indoors until the creatures were dealt with. You can almost feel the fear, the smell of damp stone, the scratching beneath floorboards. Scholars still argue whether these stories were purely allegorical, meant to scare children and enforce hygienor reports of real, rare events. Oddly, some rat kings were believed to have protective qualities. Strange as it sounds, a rat king preserved and displayed in a household supposedly warded off evil spirits. You can almost picture a velvet-lined shelf with a grotesque bundle of rats staring down the room like some macabre security system. Of course, you need nerves of steel to live under the gaze of 100 tiny teeth and beady eyes, even if they were embalmed or mummified. One of the most famous Rat King accounts comes from Hamelin, the same town that birthed the Pied Piper legend. People speculated whether the Piper story and Rat Kings were connected, the real plague of rodents inspiring musical revenge in folklore. You imagine a piper walking through foggy streets, rats dancing and writhing, children following unknowingly. Fringe historians debate whether rat kings fueled these legends directly, or if storytellers simply borrowed terrifying imagery to spice up morality tales. As you peek into an old cellar, you see remnants of nests, chewed wooden beams, and tiny footprints frozen in mud. It's uncanny how small creatures inspired such huge fears. Some rat kings reportedly had tails stuck together with substances as strange as gum, resin, or even blood, creating horrific tangles. You wince, thinking of the poor rodents caught in their own chaotic web. Scholars still argue whether rat kings were natural accidents, or sometimes the work of mischief makers hoping to awe or terrify neighbors. Walking past the marketplace again, you notice a child pointing excitedly at a jar containing a dried rat king, like a freakish collectible. In a way, the townsfolk were already treating these terrifying bundles as curiosities, a mix of fear and fascination. Perhaps it was human nature to marvel at what they didn't understand. And maybe that's why some legends survived centuries, the visceral horror of seeing multiple lives entwined, yet somehow still animated in memory. You shake your head, grateful your journey is imaginary, yet oddly captivated by the blend of fact, fear, and folklore that made rat kings infamous. By the time you step back into the dim light of the main street, the tales linger in your mind. Rat King's warranty, just stories, they were reminders that the medieval world teetered on the line between superstition, nature, and the bizarre, sometimes deadly reality of life in dense, rodent-filled towns. Remember that beaked plague doctor from the alley? Rat Kings were their uninvited companions, another sign that medieval life was stranger and more horrifying than a bedtime story lets on. You push open the heavy wooden door of a castle keep, the hinges groaning like the sigh of centuries past, and immediately feel the weight of history pressing in. Cursed objects lurk in shadowed corners, their stories whispered in hushed tones by servants and squires who swore they'd seen items move of their own accord. You probably assume these tales are just superstitions, but some of these artifacts had real, sometimes tragic consequences. Historians still argue whether the curse was truly supernatural or a clever way to explain accidents, deaths, and the occasional financial disaster among the noble classes. Your eyes catch a jeweled chalice glinting in the torchlight. Local legend says a margrave once drank from it, only to fall gravely ill. Modern researchers suggest the cup was lined with toxic lida, genuine danger masked by centuries of legend. It makes you pause, imagining yourself reaching for a sip, oblivious to the poison lurking in ornate craftsmanship. Fringe reports claim the spirit of the cup's original owner cursed it, but the truth might be far simpler, a deadly combination of metal, wine, and bad luck. Moving along the stone corridors, you notice a tapestry depicting a dragon, its eyes almost too lifelike. People whispered that anyone who mocked it would suffer misfortune, and indeed, some lords who laughed at its embroidered ferocity did meet untimely ends. You think about how fear can amplify coincidence. Scholars still argue whether these curses were psychological mechanisms to enforce obedience or merely convenient storytelling after the fact. In the armory, a sword lies on a rack with a note pinned beside it. Beware the blade of the fallen knight. It is said that every owner after him met a violent fate. You heft it lightly, feeling the balance and the cold steel against your palm. Oddly enough, analysis of the hilt reveals cracks and flaws that could have caused it to break in combat, inadvertently injuring its wielders. Here's the quirky part. Some fringe accounts suggest these swords emitted a strange metallic hum when drawn, an eerie phenomenon that terrified guards and servants alike. You chuckle, thinking of how imagination and fear can transform a simple flaw into a legendary curse. A cabinet catches your attention next, carved with strange runes and symbols. It once belonged to a wealthy alchemist who reportedly vanished after meddling with mystical experiments. Fringe tales say that opening the cabinet without permission could summon ghosts or plagues. You kneel to examine it and notice traces of arsenic, a deadly compound used both for experimentation and assassination. Maybe the curse wasn't supernatural, after all, just practical chemistry disguised as legend. Historians still argue whether the most famous cursed cabinets were truly dangerous or merely scary storytelling. Passing into the dining hall, a crystal decanter gleams from the table. Supposedly, drinking from it during a lunar eclipse would invite misfortune. Oddly, chemical analysis centuries later revealed the decanter's stopper leached a small amount of mercury into liquids. You can't help but shudder, realizing that many cursed objects were physically hazardous, making superstition a convenient cover for accidents that were otherwise unexplained. Fringe reports even claim that some objects carried strange vibrations or energies perceptible only to sensitive individuals, blending early scientific observation with mystical interpretation. You tiptoe past a portrait of a stern-faced duke, rumored to cast his displeasure like a shadow on the room. Some visitors swore the eyes followed them, and guests often tripped or dropped items while standing beneath it. Modern interpretations suggest that the subtle tilting of light across textured paint and human imagination created optical illusions that convinced people the Duke's glare was real. You chuckle quietly, thinking about the power of perception and maybe the need for a sense of humor in the Middle Ages. Historians still argue whether these optical effects were intentionally designed or purely coincidental, but the legends endured. In a back chamber, you find a small jewelry box inscribed with cryptic symbols. It once belonged to a countess who died under mysterious circumstances. Stories claim anyone who touched it would suffer misfortune, but forensic analysis reveals traces of toxic plants once stored inside. Sometimes, curses were accidental, not deliberate, yet the supernatural interpretation made them unforgettable. Fringe scholars suggest that the fear surrounding these objects actually preserved them, giving modern historians insight into medieval materials and daily life. One of the quirkiest items is a tiny wooden figurine rumored to predict death in the household. Whenever a family member fell ill, the figurine's eyes supposedly turned red. You lean in close and notice faint iron staining near the paint, which could have reacted to humidity or temperature changes, creating a subtle shift in color. You smirk at how science masqueraded as magic. Historians still argue whether objects like these influenced real behavior. Did families act differently because of fear, inadvertently creating the curse's effects? You wander into the chapel adjacent to the keep, where an ornate bell rests. Legend says that ringing it at midnight would summon spirits. You lift it slightly, testing the tone. The sound resonates eerily through the stone walls, and it's easy to imagine villagers retreating in terror, attributing any strange noises to ghostly interference. Some fringe reports suggest that tiny structural vibrations amplified sound in unusual ways, making ordinary ringing seem supernatural. It's another example of how perception, architecture, and legend intertwined seamlessly in medieval life. By the time you leave the castle, stepping into the cool night air, you can't help but marvel at the blend of superstition, chemistry, and human imagination that gave life to these cursed objects. The walls still whisper secrets, the tapestries seem to watch, and the objects remain silent but potent. You remember that beaked plague doctor from the alley, and the tangled rat kings. You begin to see a pattern. In medieval Europe, the line between reality and legend was thin, and sometimes fear itself could make an object deadly. The stories aren't just entertaining, they're windows into a world where superstition, accident, and imagination collided in ways both horrifying and fascinating. You find yourself trudging through a muddy village path just past sunset, the scent of livestock and smoke thick in the air, and hear whispers that make you freeze. He's seen one, the werewolf. in medieval Europe. Tales of shape-shifting beasts weren't just bedtime stories, they were woven into the legal and social fabric. People believed that ordinary villagers could transform into wolves to prey upon neighbors, livestock, or even entire hamlets. Historians still argue whether werewolf legends were rooted in actual crimes, psychological conditions, or mass hysteria fueled by fear and folklore. A small cottage comes into view, windows glowing faintly with firelight, and you picture the family inside whispering about the full moon. Fringe accounts suggest that some accused werewolves actually suffered from hypotrichosis, a rare condition causing excessive hair growth, or clinical lycanthropy, a psychological disorder where people genuinely believed they transform. Imagine being convinced you turn into a wolf each month, then being accused of murder because of your appearance. It's equal parts tragic and bizarre. As you step closer to the village square, the scent of roasted meat mingles with damp earth. One infamous trial recounts a man accused of terrorizing his town, leaving mysterious claw marks on barns and sheep carcasses. The villagers were terrified, and the local judge demanded justice. Modern forensic analysis suggests the culprit might have been an actual wolf or pack, but back then, the line between animal attacks and human malice was blurred. Fringe historians even speculate whether some werewolf cases were convenient excuses to punish criminals without solid evidence. You hear a bark, or maybe a growl in the distance, and your pulse quickens. Some accused werewolves were seasoned criminals who confessed under tortured admitting to heinous acts while claiming transformation under a curse. Others swore they had been bewitched by witches or cursed through grudges. Scholars still argue whether confessions were genuine beliefs or simply a survival tactic under medieval judicial practices. You can't help but shiver imagining the claustrophobic courtroom, the smell of sweat, the murmurs of a fearful crowd, and the sharp edge of the law looming like a hungry wolf itself. In one cottage, you notice silver amulets and charms, often hung above doorways or sewn into clothing. People believed silver could repel werewolves, a practice that coincidentally aligns with the fact that silver has mild antimicrobial properties, useful in a world rife with disease. Fringe accounts suggest villagers sometimes smeared wolfsbane on doors, thinking it kept the cursed at bay. It probably smelled awful, but it may have helped reduce rodent populations, another subtle, accidental protective effect. You imagine sneezing as you tiptoe past, half grateful for the medicinal benefits. Night falls, and the moon casts an eerie glow over the village, elongating shadows into shapes that almost seem alive. Some folklore tells of entire families attacked by lycanthropes, only to later discover they had fallen victim to wolves or human criminals exploiting the fear of supernatural beings. Historians still argue whether these legends were built upon isolated events that snowballed into mass panic, or whether society needed monsters to explain random misfortune. You glance at the skeletal trees swaying above, feeling the tension between imagination and reality. In fringe accounts, some alleged werewolves were actually soldiers or brigands who used the superstition to hide their identities while committing theft or murder. They might cover themselves in animal pelts or paint, moving under moonlight to avoid detection. Villagers, already primed by fear, would swear they saw transformation, an ordinary man becoming a beast. The mind is a curious thing when combined with darkness, cold, and rumor. You imagine a lone figure darting between shadows. The eyes of the village, convinced they are witnessing magic when it is merely mischief, desperation, or coincidence. And then there are the trials, where the accused were literally executed for being wolves. Sometimes the crime was robbery or murder, but the werewolf accusation added a veneer of moral outrage, making punishment seem righteous. Fringe stories suggest that in some regions, the belief was so ingrained that jurors would look for physical traits, sextra hair, unusual teeth, or even unusual behavior to prove transformation. You shake your head, thinking how fear can warp perception, turning ordinary humans into monsters in the minds of their neighbors. Historians still argue how much of the werewolf frenzy was cultural narrative versus real criminal investigation. By the time you leave the village, the moon slipping behind clouds, the forest around you seems alive with unseen eyes. Werewolves weren't just stories. They were a lens through which medieval people interpreted danger, crime, and morality. Some legends were frighteningly accurate, others wildly exaggerated. Yet the tension between reality and myth was always present. You remember the cursed objects, and Rat Kings, the common thread is the same: fear, imagination, and the need to explain the unknown-shaped lives in ways both tragic and fascinating. Tonight, the village whispers linger in your ears, a reminder that even legends can contain threads of truth if you dare to look closely enough.
You step out onto a rain-slicked road lined with timber-framed inns, the scent of damp wood and spilled ale mixing into an intoxicating, slightly sour aroma. The locals warn you to avoid the upper floors after dark, murmuring that ghosts linger in the rafters. Haunted inns were the medieval equivalent of modern horror movies, and some tales actually stem from real events. You probably think it's all superstition, but imagine checking into a dim room with a crooked bed, the candlelight flickering, and suddenly hearing footsteps pacing above you. Historians still argue whether these hauntings were fabricated to boost business, genuine psychological phenomena, or actual spectral activity. One in the Silver Stag had a reputation that spanned counties. Patrons reported chairs moving on their own, mugs tipped over, and cold drafts brushing past even on warm summer nights. Fringe accounts describe shadowy figures appearing in the corners of rooms, whispering secrets in languages no one understood. You lean against the creaking door, imagining a long-dead innkeeper passing judgment on noisy guests. And yet, in many cases, these phenomena can be traced to old floorboards, drafts, or the occasional mischievous Stafford, though that doesn't make the tales any less chilling. You wander into the common room, the hearth fire crackling and the smell of roasting meat tempting you. Some haunted inns were the sites of actual murders, betrayals, or mysterious disappearances. Patrons reported seeing the victims' apparitions, a kind of grim echo of violence. Scholars still argue whether these spirits were based on real tragedies or if imagination magnified ordinary occurrences into ghostly legends. You shiver as you imagine the life of a medieval travel-a-dusty, tired and suddenly sharing space with shadows that may or may not be alive. In fringe stories, some inns had rooms cursed by witchcraft. One tale tells of a chamber that trapped all who entered in nightmares until they confessed sins they never committed. Oddly, such tales sometimes had roots in genuine practices. Certain landlords used psychological tricks to control guests, perhaps subtly coercing them into paying extra for safety or comfort. You glance around the dim corners of the room, imagining the tricks of light and reflection creating illusions of floating figures or glowing eyes. Historians still argue whether some hauntings were genuine spiritual claims or clever manipulations of guests' perceptions. You notice a staircase leading to the upper floors. Several patrons whisper about a figure who appears at the top, pale-faced and silent, always just at the edge of vision. Fringe accounts suggest this could have been an actor hired to scare guests or perhaps a traveler, with an odd illness causing pallor and unusual movements. You imagine someone leaning over a banister, the candlelight throwing their shadow into a monstrous shape, and a young traveler screaming in alarm. In a time without electric lighting or modern psychology, the mind could turn shadows into terrifying specters. Across Europe, haunted inns often shared similar features: creaky floors, unexplained noises, and tales of spirits attached to tragedies. Sometimes, chroniclers added embellishments to entertain or warn others, which later became accepted lore. You imagine flipping a diary from centuries past, reading about a room where a servant was said to vanish mysteriously, and knowing it could have been anything from a secret passage to a misremembered accident. Scholars still argue how much of inn-based haunting lore was designed for storytelling versus actual experiences. Interestingly, some inns gained fame and more business because of their ghost stories. Travelers sought them out, hoping for a thrill or a story to share back home. Fringe accounts suggest that some proprietors subtly encouraged sightings, hanging curtains in odd ways, leaving windows slightly open to create drafts, or using props to startle guests. You can almost hear the chuckles of a clever innkeeper turning fear into a profit. The interplay of human imagination and suggestion is fascinating, and often indistinguishable from what people call the supernatural. By midnight, you find yourself leaning against the doorway of the Silver Stag, the fire now just embers, and the unquiet except for the occasional groan of wood. You think back to the haunted tales, the footsteps above, the whispers in dark corridors. Some were probably clever tricks, some psychological responses to fatigue and fear, and some, who knows, might have been something else entirely. Yet the stories endure, a mix of terror, fascination, and curiosity that makes you pause at every creaking floorboard in your own modern apartment. Haunted inns remind you that medieval life was never just about survival. It was about stories, experiences, and the thrill of the unknown, blending fact with imagination in ways that still creep into our minds centuries later.
The road bends eastward now, and you find yourself walking toward a gray silhouette rising beyond the Mista Monastery, ancient and stern, its bell tower barely visible through the drizzle. You hear chanting in the distance, low and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of another world. Inside those stone walls, monks once dedicated their lives to prayer, copying manuscripts and recording the knowledge that might otherwise have vanished forever. Yet even here, among silence and devotion, strange and unsettling things were whispered to happen. You enter through the archway, greeted by the smell of wax, parchment, and damp limestone. The air feels thick, almost electric, as if the walls remember every word ever spoken here. In the scriptoria, the writing room's rows of monks sit under flickering candles, bent over thick pages of vellum. Each scratch of the quill echoes like a secret being written into eternity. You imagine them working in silence, hour after hour, copying sacred texts, but also occasionally recording things not meant for public eyes, forbidden experiments, coded visions, or perhaps chronicles of the supernatural. Historians have found margins filled with curious drawings, half-human creatures, bizarre astronomical diagrams, and cryptic notes that seem to record dreams. Some believe these monks suffered from isolation-induced hallucinations. Others argue they were witnesses to something far beyond explanation. Fringe accounts speak of a few monasteries that experimented with angelic communication, trying to translate sounds heard during prayer into celestial messages. The lines between spirituality and madness were thin. You can almost see it. A lone monk, eyes wide, insisting he saw an angel's shadow move across the floor as the candles flickered. At night, the monastery would sink into absolute silence, except for the occasional toll of the bell marking the hours. You can picture it, dozens of robed figures sleeping in narrow cots, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. In some records, monks spoke of voices that were not human, reciting prayers from the dark. Rational historians suggest the sounds came from wind tunnels through stone corridors. Yet even now, when researchers record inside medieval monasteries, the acoustics can create eerie harmonic stones that seem to shift direction, like invisible choirs singing. Some monks reportedly went missing. Chronicles describe brothers who wandered into the forest after visions of divine light, never to return. A few were found days later, delirious, speaking in tongues or describing stars that sang in patterns. Scholars still argue whether this was mental illness, hunger, or early mysticism bordering on trance states. One particular manuscript, known as the Silent Codex, contains lines scratched out so violently that the parchment tore. Underneath, using infrared scans, historians found strange symbols resembling modern astronomical charts, centuries ahead of their time. How could such precision exist before telescopes? Fringe theorists claim divine inspiration. Others whisper of something else, visitors from beyond. As you explore the dim corridors, the torches sputtering, your footsteps echo endlessly. You reach the library, a chamber filled with ancient manuscripts that smell of time itself. Dust drifts in beams of light like falling ash. Here, the monks stored not just religious texts, but also fragments of lost civilizations, writings from Egypt, Persia, and forgotten scholars of the East. Many of these texts contained astronomical alignments, herbal recipes, and geometric maps that hint at advanced knowledge. Some pages were deliberately erased, perhaps out of fear, or perhaps because they revealed too much. Fringe historians suggest that a handful of monastic orders guarded knowledge about natural energy, magnetic currents, ley lines, even healing vibrations that modern science only began to rediscover centuries later. You imagine a monk standing beneath a dome, chanting specific tones that make the air tremble, a primitive form of frequency resonance. Could such sound alter consciousness? You remember how certain sounds, Tadelo hums, droning chant scan, make your skin prickle or your eyes water. Maybe they knew something we've only begun to understand. Then there's the story of Brother Aldrich. He was said to have spent his final years in a silent vow, never speaking but endlessly writing symbols no one could decipher. When he died, his body was found in the chapel kneeling, his hands still clutching a quill, and his face turned toward the stars through a small window. The manuscript beside him, a spiral of text that, when translated, predicted an event centuries later, a light returning to the northern sky. Modern astronomers note that this coincides eerily with the reappearance of a rare supernova documented in the same region. Coincidence or something beyond time itself? You step outside into the monastery courtyard. The rain has stopped, and the night is quiet, except for the whisper of leaves. You look up at the same stars the monks once studied, wondering if they, too, felt this same mixture of awe and unease. Their world was both smaller and infinitely larger than yours, bound by faith, yet open to mysteries no one dared to name. In their isolation, they preserved humanity's past but may also have brushed against truths the rest of the world still fears to face. You breathe in the damp air, the scent of moss and stone, grounding you back in the present. The chanting fades, the torches dim, and you realize even silence in the medieval world wasn't truly empty. It was full of echoes, fears, and perhaps the faint hum of something eternal, waiting patiently to be rediscovered. You wake the next morning on a cold stone bench outside the monastery, breath fogging in the crisp air. The horizon is smeared with gold as dawn breaks, and you hear the first sounds of merchants stirring in the nearby town, wooden carts creaking, hooves clopping against cobblestones, voices bargaining even before breakfast. You follow the smell of smoke and sulfur to a small workshop tucked behind a row of homes. Above the doorway hangs a symbol, a circle, intersected by a triangle and a line, faintly burned into the wood. You've stepped into the world of alchemy. Inside, the air is thick with the sharp Thames of metal and vinegar. Glass flasks bubble on open flames, colors shifting from amber to deep green. The alchemist himself looks up from his table, spectacles glinting, beard singed at the ends. He doesn't seem surprised to see you. Maybe because in this time, strangers who wander in often bring news or inspiration. He mutters something about mercury, salt, and sulfur, the three primes, said to compose all matter, and goes back to stirring a shimmering mixture. You've heard the legends, medieval alchemists turning lead into gold, seeking the philosopher's stone, hunting immortality. It all sounds like myth. Yet, as you watch the process, the meticulous heating, the patient observation, you start to see it differently. Maybe it wasn't about gold at all. Maybe it was about transformation itself, both material and spiritual. Historians still argue whether alchemists were true scientists or mystics chasing illusions. But what's undeniable is that their experiments sometimes led to real discoveries. The alchemists of Europe accidentally created some of the earliest forms of acids, alloys, and even gunpowder-like mixtures. In one monastery record, there is mention of fire that cannot be quenched by water, an early description of Greek fire, perhaps, or an early chemical compound gone wrong. You imagine being there, the crackling heat, the glass trembling from pressure, the smell of something unknown taking shape. Fringe accounts tell of a Florentine alchemist who, while trying to distill essence of light, stumbled upon phosphorus centuries before its official discovery. He described it as a ghost flame trapped in air. Later, explorers used it to create glowing paints and signal fires. Science born from superstition. But not every experiment went so well. In Prague, a nobleman's alchemist reportedly blew half the tower off his employer's castle while seeking gold through divine thunder. The townspeople swore they saw blue fire curling around the tower's spire before the explosion. Scholars claim it was the result of chemical vapors igniting the local legend, that the alchemist summoned lightning itself. You lean closer to a shelf of dusty manuscripts, latent text, ink faded, diagrams of circles within circles. They aren't just formulas, they're maps of thought. One page shows a human figure split into halves, light and dark, connected by a serpent. Another shows geometric patterns resembling modern atomic structures. How could they have known? Some historians say these drawings reflect mystical visions, not scientific knowledge. Others suggest that intuition sometimes reached truths logic hadn't caught up to yet. In the corner, you notice a small cage. Something flickers inside. The alchemist lifts the cloth, covering it, and reveals a piece of glowing metal, pulsing faintly, as if alive. Captured fire, he murmurs. You realize it's a chemical reaction, but to him, it's proof that nature holds divine secrets. He scribbles notes furiously, mumbling about purification through heat. Maybe that's what alchemy always was, a metaphor for the soul. You endure trials, you burn, you shed impurities, and in the end, you become something purer. Still, alchemy had its darker side. Some practitioners mixed strange concoctions, claiming to heal every ailment, elixirs that instead poisoned the drinkers. One infamous mixture, aqua vita, or water of life, was basically crude alcohol. It didn't make anyone immortal, but it did make them forget their mortality for a while. You can almost hear the laughter from the taverns as peasants took miracle medicine in small glass vials, thinking they'd cheated death. The church's stance on alchemy wavered between cautious interest and outright condemnation. Some monks practiced it in secret, seeing it as uncovering God's hidden architecture. Others called it heresy. In 1317, Pope John XXII issued a decree against deceptive alchemical frauds, yet records show several clerics kept laboratories hidden beneath monasteries. One legend tells of an abbot who vanished after claiming he had created true gold, but refused to share the method. His cell was found empty, the door locked from the inside, and a single line written on the wall: "He who masters matter becomes matter itself." Modern scientists still puzzle over ancient chemical recipes that seem too advanced for their time. Compounds resistant to corrosion, inks that don't fade, glass that can flex without breaking. Some even speculate that a few alchemists stumbled onto nanostructures by accident, long before microscopes. Of course, historians debate this endlessly. Were they geniuses, or just lucky fools, surrounded by smoke and mystery? You stand by the window as light streams in, cutting through the fumes. Outside, a child plays with a coin, sunlight glinting off its surface. You realize how symbolic that image is. Humans forever fascinated by transformation, by the shimmer between the mundane and the miraculous. Maybe that's why the legends endure. They remind us that the boundary between myth and discovery is thinner than we think. The alchemist turns to you, eyes glimmering behind soot-smeared glass. "Everything changes," he says quietly, "even ignorance." You watch him pour liquid silver into a mold shaped like a human hand. It hisses, cools, and hardens, a moment captured between chaos and creation. You take a deep breath, the smell of metal and mystery lingering in your lungs. As you step out, the workshop door creaks shut behind you. The world outside feels brighter, as if you've glimpsed the raw machinery of nature itself. And you wonder how many truths began as legends whispered in rooms just like this, by dreamers who refused to stop burning, even when the world told them to cool down. The narrow streets grow louder, now vendors shouting, children chasing stray chickens, blacksmiths hammering sparks into the air. You follow the scent of roasted almonds and pitch toward the marketplace, the living heart of any medieval town. Here, gossip traveled faster than any royal decree, and rumors often mattered more than truth. It's a kaleidoscope of noise and color. Fabrics from the east, gleaming brass instruments, and yes gauges covered in cloth, shaking faintly from whatever stirs inside. You're drawn to one stall in particular. The merchant, a tall man with a crooked smile, announces his wares in a booming voice. Come, see the dragon hatchling, straight from the depths of the Holy Land. He whips off the cloth with theatrical flair, revealing something between a lizard and a fish, preserved in salt water. Children gasp, priests frown, scholars squint. The man swears on his mother's soul it's real. You lean closer. The creature's jaws are sharp, its skin leathery, its eyes faintly gold. A closer inspection, though, reveals fine stitches along the neck. You realize what you're looking at, a clever fake, stitched from parts of other animals. Yet history tells us that many such monsters once fooled even the educated. Medieval bestiaries were filled with illustrations of mermaids, basilisks, and griffins, all allegedly witnessed firsthand. But not every creature was fantasy. Some legends came frighteningly close to truth. Take the story of the sea monk. In 1546, fishermen near Denmark caught a humanoid creature from the water-scaly, long-armed, and draped in what looked like robes of flesh. Scholars across Europe debated whether it was a demon or a natural wonder. Historians today think it might have been a malformed shark. But the woodcut drawings of that year show eerie accuracy, almost as if the witnesses saw something no one could quite explain. Historians still argue whether these encounters were elaborate hoaxes or the byproduct of ignorance and weather. Perhaps a few were genuine glimpses of animals since extinct. Remember, this was an era when people believed in the Crocodile sea beast, so enormous it could drag ships down with its tentacles. For centuries, sailors returned with tales of monstrous squids, and scientists scoffed. Then, in 1857, a real giant squid washed ashore in Denmark, its tentacles stretching nearly 30 feet. The legend, it turned out, wasn't entirely wrong. As you wander through the market, you hear whispers of another marvel, a talking bird owned by a nobleman's servant. You arrive to find a small crowd watching a green parrot repeat phrases in Latin. You laugh, but think, in a world without television, that must have looked like witchcraft. Medieval Europe's fascination with exotic animals bordered on obsession. Leopards, apes, and even crocodiles were paraded through town squares as proof of divine imagination. Monarchs kept menageries of creatures gifted from foreign lands. Henry III of England famously housed lions, and a polar bear in the Tower of London records show the bear was even taken to fish in the Thames on a chain. Yet some stories got darker. Merchants occasionally sold fairy corpses to nobles, seeking proof of the supernatural tiny figures made of twigs, fish bones, and wax. A few were buried with solemn ritual, as if they were sacred beings. Archaeologists have found these in graves, evidence that some people truly believed they'd touched another realm. Not all the market's legends came from cellars. Sometimes they came from what was eaten. One German record from the 14th century tells of flesh that glowed in the dark. Villagers believed it to be cursed meat. Scientists now think it was due to bioluminescent bacteria on spoiled pork. Imagine the terror, your dinner literally shining on your plate. No wonder superstition thrived. And then, tucked behind the stalls, you find another attraction. A man displaying what he calls the preserved head of a saint. The crowd crosses themselves as he recounts how the relic heals fevers and blesses newborns. You can see the coins piling in his hand. Later, church officials would test some of these relics and find them suspiciously human but not saintly. One cathedral was found to hold 3 skulls of John the Baptist. Historians joke that medieval Europe had enough holy bones to rebuild an entire army of saints. Still, faith and commerce walked hand in hand. A strange sound draws your attention, a low growl, followed by gasps. A crowd gathers near a wooden cart covered with iron bars. Inside, pacing in restless circles, is a creature you almost mistake for a large cat. But its eyes huge, amber, and alien lock with yours. The merchant proudly calls it a manticore, a man-eating beast from India. Historians would later confirm such beasts existed, though by a different name, tigers. Many Europeans of the time had never seen one, and their exaggerated drawing striped demons with human faces turned truth into myth. As the sun dips lower, torches flicker to life. The marketplace hums with voices, laughter, and the rattle of coins. You pause near a group of children gathered around a storyteller. She's old, face lined like parchment, voice cracked yet melodic. She speaks of creatures that live in mirrors, of serpents that guard hidden treasure beneath the cathedral. The kids lean in, wide-eyed. You realize this is how legends spread, not through books, but through breath. Somewhere between curiosity and fear, truth often mutated. A traveler would see a crocodile for the first time, call it a dragon, and by the time the tale reached another town, it had wings and breathed fire. The medieval marketplace wasn't just a place for trade, was the internet of its age, a network of rumors, wonders, and clickbait curiosities. You watch as the stalls begin to close, merchants packing away their miracles. The last thing you see before the night takes over is the stitched dragon being lifted gently into a wooden crate, its glassy eyes catching the candlelight one last time. For a moment, it almost looks alive, and you think maybe that's the real magic of the Middle Ages, how imagination could breathe life into anything, even a lie stitched from truth. The streets empty out as dusk falls, the laughter and bartering of the market fading into the low hum of evening bells. You follow a trail of torchlight up a hill overlooking the town square. There, in the orange glow, stands a wooden platform, a scaffold, dark with age and stories. The air around it feels charged, not with holiness, but with the echo of fear. Tonight's legend isn't about beasts or magic. It's about people land, what happens when justice becomes theater. Execution in the medieval world wasn't just punishment, it was performance. You can almost hear the crowd gathering, merchants, peasants, even children pressing forward, eager to see the spectacle. Vendors hawk roasted nuts and spiced wine as if it's a fair. The condemned stands at the center, trembling. But the audience isn't thinking of mercy, they're thinking of entertainment. You've heard of the guillotine, but that came much later. In these days, justice wore many masks, each crueler than the last. Hanging was common, of course, but in certain towns, the condemned might be broken on the wheel, beheaded, or burned. It sounds barbaric, but remember, the idea of justice was as much about symbolism as law. To medieval minds, public punishment purified the community. Evil was a disease, and this was the cure. You feel a chill as a bell tolls, once, twice, 3 times. Somewhere below, the crowd quiets. A man in red robes steps forward, an executioner, his face hidden. He reads from a parchment, voice calm, almost rehearsed. The condemned is accused of heresy, theft, witchcraft. Take your pick. The script rarely changes. The audience murmurs approval. Historians still argue whether people truly believed in the righteousness of these punishments or simply found comfort in the spectacle. One chronicler from Paris wrote that even children would play execution in the streets, crafting tiny gallows from sticks. Imagine that childhood games inspired by death. You look closer at the scaffold and notice something unsettling. The craftsmanship. The joints are polished smooth, the steps reinforced. It's not hastily built, it's permanent. A symbol of law's presence, yes, but also a stage that never truly closed. Some cities even paid professional executioners a salary, housing them near the gallows. They became grim celebrities, half admired. There's one famous story from Nuremberg about an executioner named Meister Franz. He was so precise that he could behead a man cleanly with a single stroke and claimed to set the soul free with mercy. He kept a meticulous journal of his work, every crime, every sentence, every death. It survives to this day. In one chilling entry, he describes an execution where the condemned thanked him for a swift blade and a steady hand. You can almost hear the nervous laughter that must have followed. Yet not all executions were cruel for cruelty's sake. Some were designed as lessons. Thieves might be branded instead of killed, a permanent mark that told the world their sin. It's said that one man, branded on the cheek, later became a monk, using his scar as proof of redemption. The line between justice and salvation was thin, and both were written on the skin. Then there were the mock executions acts of psychological torture meant to scare rather than kill. In one recorded case from England, a man accused of plotting against the crown was blindfolded, made to kneel, and hear the blade whistle past his neck only to be spared at the last second. The king wanted to prove mercy. The man fainted before he even knew he'd lived. The audience didn't just watch, they participated. Crowds sometimes decided the condemned's fate. A single cry for mercy could sway a judge, or a chant for death could seal it. Justice in the medieval square was often democracy by mob. You can almost feel the collective heartbeat of hundreds pressing forward, craving the next act in the story. Of course, executions weren't only for the guilty. The line between law and politics was as flexible as a hangman's rope. Witches, heretics, and dissenters often found themselves on the wrong side of truth. When Joan of Arc was burned in 1431, thousands gathered to witness it. They said her heart didn't burn, a legend historians can't quite confirm or deny. Some fragments of bone were later displayed as relics, as if holiness and horror could coexist in the same flame. Even the instruments of death carried myths. The axe that beheaded nobles was said to sing before it struck. The wheel that crushed bones was rumored to turn on its own at night. Executioners whispered that the gallows creaked when someone was destined to die soon. You can almost hear it now, the wood shifting, a ghost of sound beneath the wind. One particularly strange account comes from Milan, where the condemned were sometimes allowed to play a final song before execution. Records show that in 1487, A lute player performed a haunting melody that silenced the entire crowd. Moments later, the rope tightened and the song became legend. Centuries later, a variation of that same melody was found in an old Italian folk tune, music born from the edge of death. Historians still debate whether these executions truly deterred crime or simply entertained a society addicted to spectacle. The numbers suggest otherwise. Crime continued. Punishments grew harsher, and the scaffold remained busy. Perhaps people didn't come for justice. Perhaps they came to confront mortality from a safe distance. Watching someone else die was, in a twisted way, proof that they were still alive. The platform stands empty now. The crowd disperses, leaving only silence and a few drifting embers from torches. You step closer to the scaffold and run your hand along the cold wood. It's smooth, worn down by countless tragedies, a reminder that legend and law often shared the same stage. As you walk away, the sound of the bell fades behind you. In the darkness, you can almost hear the echo of applause, soft, distant, eternal. You drift deeper into the candlelit shadows of medieval Europe, where whispers of secret brotherhoods coil through the streets like smoke. Behind the cathedral, in a locked cellar beneath a tanner's shop, a group of hooded men gathers in silence. They call themselves the Companions of the Flame. You can almost hear the scrape of iron keys turning in the lock, the faint scent of wine and wax thick in the air. Each man carries a small symbol, a triangle within a circle, carved into a wooden medallion. To outsiders, they're just merchants, scribes, or stonecutters. But tonight, they perform a ritual older than any church law. No one truly knows where these secret societies came from. Some say they began as worker guilds, protecting trade secrets and craft techniques. Others whisper that their roots stretch back to the ancient mystery schools of Egypt and Rome. Whatever the truth, their symbols, compasses, stars, serpents, and keys hide messages only the initiated can read. You picture them kneeling before a carved altar, chanting in Latin, lux ex tenebris, light from darkness. To them, the world above, the world of kings and bishops, is blind. But they claim to seek the hidden order beneath chaos. The rituals are strange. Some demand silence for a full hour before a single candle is lit. Others require a drop of wine to be spilled for those who built before, and in one particularly eerie record found in a 14th century manuscript, new members were blindfolded and made to touch cold iron chains, a symbolic reminder that ignorance is its own prison. But not all societies were harmless. In Italy, whispers of the Black Brotherhood spread, men accused of dark alchemy, of summoning visions in smoke, of using the bones of criminals for divination. No one ever proved their existence, but a papal decree was issued warning against those who meet in secret and invoke the shadows. Centuries later, historians still can't agree where myth ends and truth begins. Some argue that these rituals were simply coded meetings of early scientists experimenting with light and metals in a time when such curiosity could get you burned as a heretic. And yet, in 1367, a Royal Guard S report describes breaking into a cellar in Paris and finding a stone chamber lined with symbols no one could read. At its center stood a table, and on it a skull with a silver crown, nothing else. The room was sealed afterward, Maybe these societies weren't summoning demons. Maybe they were summoning ideas, revolutionary, forbidden ones, hidden behind oaths and passwords. You wonder how many of those secrets still survive. A pattern in the cathedrals, a carving on a gravestone, a word hidden in an old builder's diary, all reminders that the past was just built with stone, but with mystery. And as your eyes grow heavier, you imagine one last sound, the faint echo of voices in the dark, reciting a vow that still chills the centuries, to know, to dare, to will, to keep silent. The candle flickers, the chamber fades, sleep takes you before you can ask what truth they were guarding. You awaken beneath a painted ceiling, the smell of incense and damp stone pressing against the air. Somewhere outside, a bell tolls. You're standing in a medieval shrine, one of hundreds scattered across Europe, where peasants, nobles, and the dying once crawled on their knees to beg for healing. They came here because they believed this place was touched by miracle. A drop of holy water, a saint's bone, a relic said to shine faintly in the dark. The air hums with whispered prayers, desperate, trembling, human. You see them, a mother carrying her sick child wrapped in linen, her hands trembling as she lights a candle at the altar. A soldier with one arm, his sword traded for a wooden crutch. A farmer whose eyes no longer see the fields he once tilled. In every corner, candles burn low beside small offerings. A coin, a lock of hair, a carved wooden heart. They believed that faith itself could heal, and sometimes it seemed to. There are records, strange, careful records, kept by monks of people who walked away healed. A woman cured of fever after drinking water from St. Winifred's well. A crippled child standing again after touching the robe of St. Edmund. Doctors dismissed them as coincidence, yet the accounts stretch across centuries and continents. The shrines themselves were powerful places, stone, music, and scent designed to overwhelm the senses. The chants vibrated through the air like a pulse, the flicker of light on gold, the smell of oil and herbs, all meant to lift the mind beyond the body. Modern science might call it placebo, but to those pilgrims, it was proof of heaven's hand. Yet not every miracle was pure. You can almost hear the skeptical whispers, merchants selling holy dust scraped from the floor, relic dealers peddling the bones of anyone they could find. By the 14th century, there were 3 different cathedrals claiming to have the same saint's skull. Still, something deeper lingered. Because even after the church banned the sale of relics, people kept coming, barefoot, bleeding, hoping. Some monks began to study why certain wells and springs healed better than others. In one forgotten text from 1328, a healer noted that the sacred waters of one abbey bubbled through limestone, rich with minerals now known to kill bacteria. Another shrine, famed for curing skin diseases, stood near a sulfur spring, naturally disinfectant. Perhaps the miracles were half science, half faith, the two mingling long before medicine had words for it. And there were healers outside the church, too, herbal women in forests, known as wise ones. They mixed yarrow for wounds, willow bark for pain, valerian for sleep. Many were later accused of witchcraft, but their remedies, when rediscovered centuries later, became the foundation of modern pharmacology. So maybe miracle wasn't a lie. Maybe it was an early form of knowledge, wrapped in prayer, guarded by fear. Imagine one of those pilgrims again, kneeling in the candlelight, the smell of rosemary and oil thick around them. They don't know about bacteria or minerals. They just know that for the first time in months, their child's fever breaks. And in that moment, in the soft sob of relief, the trembling gratitude, the line between faith and fact blurs. You stand quietly among them, listening. 1,000 years later, the stones still seem to hum, not with magic, but with memory. Because whether through divine touch or chemical chance, healing, real or imagined, gave people hope. And in the darkest centuries, hope itself might have been the greatest miracle of all. The candles gutter. The well reflects the last light of dawn. And you close your eyes, feeling the ancient faith of those who came before. Not foolish, not blind, but simply human. You open a door deep within an old monastery, and the air changes. Dust thickens. Silence deepens. The scent of beeswax and ink lingers like something sacred. Rows upon rows of parchment stretch into the shadows. Shelves filled with secrets that once changed the world. Here lies the memory of an age that feared knowledge almost as much as it revered it. You can almost hear the scratching of quills, monks copying, muttering, glancing nervously over their shoulders. Because in medieval Europe, words could be dangerous, books could kill. You reach for a volume wrapped in cracked leather. Its cover bears no title, just a symbol scratched into the spine, a quiet warning. It's written in Latin, but its ideas burn across time. Anatomy sketches, forbidden by the church. Treatises on planets that move not around Earth. Experiments in alchemy that whisper of transformation. Once, the keepers of such books worked in candlelight, hiding pages beneath floorboards, or sealing them behind false walls. They called their secret archives armaria prohibita, forbidden cupboards. To own the wrong text could mean excommunication. To teach from it, death. You might think of it as paranoia. But remember, power back then depended on mystery. If ordinary people could read, if they could question, if they could see the stars differently, kingdoms could crumble. Still, not all censorship came from fear alone. Sometimes it was about control. In 1231, Pope Gregory IX issued the first Index Librorum Prohibitorum, a list of banned books. It included not only heretical theology, but also early scientific texts. One scroll described blood circulation centuries before Harvey officially discovered it. Another mapped trade winds across the Atlantic before Europeans ever dared to sail that far. Historians still argue whether these discoveries were truly suppressed or merely ignored, but the coincidences feel suspicious. And then there were the lost books, manuscripts erased, burned, or rewritten over. Literally, monks reused parchment by scraping off old ink and copying holy text on top. These palimpsests hid pagan astronomy, medical formulas, even love poems beneath layers of faith. It wasn't until modern imaging that scholars found those ghost words, again, tiny whispers, trapped beneath prayer. The more you wander, the more you realize the medieval world wasn't as ignorant as people think. It knew things, terrifying things, but it couldn't always bear them. In Spain, the mystic Ramon Lull wrote about machines that could think logically, combining symbols to generate answers. His manuscripts were dismissed as blasphemy. Centuries later, his logic wheels became precursors to computing theory. In Baghdad, Scholars preserved Aristotle, Galen, and Euclid, books Europe had long destroyed. When the Crusaders returned, they carried fragments back, quietly translating them under candlelight, pretending the ideas were new revelations. Knowledge didn't die, it simply went underground. You can almost feel the tension, the tug-of-war between silence and curiosity. Imagine being one of those scribes, ink-stained fingers trembling as you copy a text that could end your life. Maybe you believe you're saving souls. Maybe you just love truth too much to let it vanish. Some of those forbidden books survived by disguise. A treatise on astronomy disguised as a prayer manual, a book of anatomy hidden behind hymns, a medical formula written as poetry. Every clever deception added another layer to the labyrinth of medieval thought, a puzzle you still walking through now. And yet, even destruction couldn't erase everything. Fire might consume parchment, but not memory. Ideas spread like rumor, from scholar to apprentice, from tavern to market stall. A lost alchemical recipe might survive in the gossip of glassmakers. A banned treatise on stars might live on in sailors' maps. You step deeper into the archive. One book catches your eye, no title, just strange circular diagrams, curling vines, an unreadable script, the Voynich manuscript. No one knows who wrote it or in what language. Its pages show plants that never existed, constellations no one's seen. Some say it's an elaborate hoax. Others think it's a lost encyclopedia encoded to survive the Inquisition. 500 years later, it still refuses to give up its secrets. Maybe that's the truest medieval legend of all, that knowledge itself wants to live, even when humans try to bury it. You blow the dust off a final page, and it flutters like a breath, soft, defiant, alive. And for a moment, in the flicker of torchlight, you feel the pulse of every forbidden word still whispering in the dark. You close the book carefully, as if returning a heartbeat to sleep, and the shelves around you seem to sigh, not with fear this time, but with relief, because you listened. You find yourself beneath the city again, only this time it's not a shrine or library you're standing in, but something colder. The air is damp, thick with the scent of clay and forgotten footsteps. Your hand grazes the wall, rough with centuries of moisture. Somewhere above, church bells ring faintly. Down here, it sounds like the city's heartbeat, muffled by earth. Welcome to the hidden veins of the medieval world, the tunnels, passageways, and escape routes that wound beneath castles, monasteries, and towns like secret lifelines. They were born from fear, fear of invasion, siege, betrayal, fear that power, once taken, might never return. You walk forward, torchlight trembling. The tunnel widens, then narrows again, just enough for one person to squeeze through sideways. The ceiling drips. Somewhere ahead, you hear the flutter of wings, bats, or maybe something less natural, if you believe the legends. These tunnels weren't fantasy. They were engineering, crude but brilliant. Medieval builders, with no modern tools, carved stone and earth by hand, aligning escape paths with wells, riverbeds, and even graveyards to conceal entrances. One famous tunnel ran beneath Warwick Castle, connecting the fortress to the River Avon. Another wound beneath the city of Chester, rumored to lead directly into a church crypt, perfect for a fleeing bishop. And yet, stories of these tunnels grew far beyond their practical use. People whispered that kings vanished through them, that spies met in candlelit chambers, that prisoners dug their way out with spoons and prayers. Some townsfolk even claimed entire underground cities existed below, echoing with the voices of monks who never came back to the surface. Of course, historians still argue whether those underground cities were real or just the exaggerated imaginations of frightened peasants. But excavations across Europe keep proving one thing: many legends had roots. In Canterbury, an entire hidden passage was discovered beneath a 14th century inn exactly where a local folktale claimed ghosts walked to the river. Turns out, it wasn't ghosts, it was smugglers. Smuggling, that's another truth tangled in myth. While nobles used tunnels to escape sieges, ordinary people used them to move contraband: salt, wine, wool, anything taxed too heavily by kings. They called it night trading. The church called it sin, but really it was survival. Still, some tunnels served darker purposes. Monks and nuns used hidden corridors, not only for safety, but for secrecy, carrying forbidden letters, heretical texts, even lovers. Beneath many abbeys ran narrow stone routes, connecting cloisters to surrounding woods. One 13th century bishop wrote angrily of immoral gatherings beneath holy ground. It's possible he wasn't exaggerating. You pause at a junction where the tunnel splits into three. On one side, faint markings, old carved symbols like suns and serpents. Were they maps or warnings? Historians can't agree. Some say masons left signs to guide them back. Others think they marked places of spiritual protection. Either way, they make you uneasy, like someone's watching from just ahead. As you continue, you notice how quiet it is. No sound but your breath and the distant drip of water. Then, a gust of cold air, an exit, maybe. You crawl forward and emerge into a hollow chamber beneath a ruined castle keep. The ceiling arches overhead, black with soot. Someone once built a fireplace down here, not an escape route. Perhaps a lord's last hideout during a siege, or a secret meeting spot for rebels plotting in the dark. There is something almost poetic about it, the way humans always carve holes in the earth when life above gets too dangerous. A tunnel isn't just a path, it's a promise, a silent oath that says, "I'll find a way out." Of course, not everyone did. Some tunnels collapsed, trapping those who built them. In 1315, during a siege in France, soldiers dug under a castle wall to plant explosives. The tunnel caved in before they could escape, their bones found centuries later, still clutching pickaxes. Even so, the idea of hidden routes persisted through architecture, stories, and the collective imagination. By the 1500s, every old building was rumored to have a secret passage, even if it didn't. Children grew up daring each other to find them. Writers wove them into ballads, and kings still demanded them in blueprints, just in case. Today, archaeologists crawl through those same tunnels, scraping dirt from the secrets of the past. They find candle stubs, wooden handles, rusted hinges, and sometimes walls that go nowhere, dead ends that feel symbolic, like history's way of saying, not every escape works. Still, there's something comforting about knowing those roots existed, proof that even in the darkest times, someone was thinking ahead, planning for survival. It's human nature, isn't it? To dig when trapped, to hide when hunted, to whisper hope through a tunnel when the world above is burning. As you turn back toward the light, your torch flickers against the rough stone. You can almost see the handprints of the people who made this passage, calloused, desperate, determined. They carved more than escape routes. They carved defiance into the earth. And as you climb the narrow steps toward daylight, you feel that defiance echo softly through the centuries, a reminder that sometimes survival is the greatest legend of all. You wake to the sound of church bells again, but this time the air feels charged. Outside the castle walls, a crowd gathers in the courtyard, murmuring beneath a gray, restless sky. Something is about to happen. Something, they say, was foretold. In medieval times, prophecy wasn't superstition, it was policy. Kings, peasants, monks, even soldiers believed the future had already been written, only waiting for someone brave or mad enough to read it aloud. You see a cloaked figure at the edge of the square, parchment in hand. He isn't a priest or scholar, just a wanderer with eyes too old for his face. He mutters of storms and stars, of blood in rivers and crowns that fall. The people lean closer, half terrified, half thrilled, because deep down they want to believe the universe is speaking directly to them. And sometimes it almost seemed to take the prophecy of Saint Malachi, written in the 12th century. It listed a line of future popes, each described with cryptic Latin phrases: the shepherd and the sailor, the flower of flowers. Centuries later, believers matched each phrase uncannily to real pontiffs, even predicting the final one, a pope from the end of the world. When Pope Francis, born in Argentina, took the throne in 2013, whispers spread again. Had the prophecy come true? Or were people, as historians still argue, simply forcing patterns onto coincidence? You wander through a monastery library, where another legend flickers through time, the visions of Hildegard of Bingen. Her writings describe iron birds darkening the sky and fire that moves faster than horses. Modern readers swear it sounds like airplanes and bombs. Historians insist she was just using vivid metaphors, but either way, her visions eerily mirror much of what history later became. And then there's Mother Shipton, England's so-called witch prophetess, born in a cave in the 1400s. She supposedly predicted the Great Fire of London, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, and even the invention of iron ships and telegraphs. Her prophecies spread like wildfire, partly because people were desperate to believe someone knew what was coming. Even Shakespeare referenced her name. Still, it wasn't only mystics and seers. Medieval scholars, working quietly with stars and mathematics, often stumbled onto prophecies that were really just patterns. In 1186, astrologers predicted a global flood based on planetary alignment. The flood never came, but the panic was so real that entire towns fasted for days. A few centuries later, those same calculations helped sailors navigate oceans. Maybe prophecy, like knowledge, just needed time to reveal its truth. The line between mysticism and science was thin. An alchemist gazing into a crystal sphere might claim to see the future, but what he was really seeing were reflections of stars, temperature changes, and smoke from his own experiments. His language was poetic, but his eyes were observant. The future, he saw, wasn't magical. It was logical, just misunderstood. And yet, some prophecies hit too close for comfort. Their S the chilling prediction recorded in a 14th century chronicle: when the towers fall and the hawks fly west, the empire's heart will crumble. It was written about a minor German war, but after 9/11, that line was rediscovered, spreading across the internet like wildfire. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe prophecy, ISNT, about seeing the future, but about noticing how history always circles back. You keep walking, past frescoes of angels holding hourglasses, past tombs carved with zodiac symbols. Everywhere you look, the medieval world seems obsessed with fate, because in a time of plague and war, people needed order, even if it came from omens. Some prophecies were grim. Before the Black Death swept Europe, chroniclers wrote of stars weeping blood and wolves howling at noon. They weren't wrong. Comets had streaked the sky that year, and the wolves, drawn by death, really had begun to roam near villages. To them, the signs were clear. To us, they were just early observations, data, before science called it that. So you begin to wonder, maybe prophecy isn't mystical at all. Maybe it's just pattern recognition, intuition wrapped in poetry. And maybe those medieval minds, closer to nature than ours, were simply better at listening. The crowd outside stirs again. Thunder rolls. The man with the parchment raises his voice. The hour approaches. The candle shortens, and kingdoms will tremble. You smile softly, knowing it could apply to any century, any crisis, any heart waiting for change. Because prophecy, true or false, always says the same thing: that nothing stays the same, that light always returns after the dark, that every fall hints at a rebirth. You turn away as the first drops of rain fall, washing the dust from the cobblestones. The parchment dissolves in the prophet's hands, words melting into the earth. And maybe that's fitting, because prophecy isn't meant to last. It's meant to warn, to guide, to make you look up. You exhale slowly, and the world feels still again. The sky clears, and just like that, the final medieval legend fades not into fear, but into understanding. The bells grow faint now, swallowed by distance. You walk through the last flickers of torchlight, your footsteps soft against the stone. The voices of prophets, healers, alchemists, and dreamers whisper behind you, fading into sleep. Every legend, every superstition, every strange truth we've wandered through tonight, it all leads to this quiet, because underneath the myths, the medieval world wasn't foolish. It was curious. It was human. You picture the scribes bent over parchment, the travelers whispering prayers by candlelight, the healers stirring herbs into hope. Each of them believed in something beyond their reach, and maybe that belief itself was the real magic. The torches dim to embers. Your breath slows. Even the earth seems to rest. You feel safe here, in this ancient hush, surrounded not by monsters or curses, but by the soft heartbeat of time. Whatever tomorrow brings, remember, every age thinks it's standing at the edge of mystery. Ours is no different. So close your eyes. Let the past settle around you like a warm cloak. The last sound you hear is a turning page, a whisper from history saying, "You made it through the darkness." Sweet dreams.